The Coal Wars were the largest working-class uprising in American history. Routinely throughout the history, Americans have had the need to consider the injustices committed against the blue-collar working class by fat-cat corporate bosses. Hardcore facts about the WV mine wars illustrate just one of these many moments. Not only do people often forget the past and increase the risk of repeating history, but they also frequently fail to see the connection between historical labor movements and the gains and impacts they have on workers' everyday lives today. Workers in the motor vehicle, oil, textile, meat processing, construction, and mining industries have all suffered at the hands of their employers, and, as a result, all of these industries have seen subsequent movements and violent insurrections to push for change, rights, and representation. The coal mining wars of West Virginia, and other parts of the country, provide a heartening story of the largest labor uprising in American history. It is a story about suffering workers, struggling families, and heroes who spoke out in the name of working people. The series of conflicts finally came to a climactic confrontation in 1921 that had been bubbling for decades. Though violent, confusing, and enraging, the West Virginia Coal Wars helped lay the foundation for more rights on behalf of miners, women, people of color, and the working class. The pre-mine wars working conditions for coal miners were abysmal. Mining is back-breaking, dangerous work, regardless of whether it's for coal, gold, silver, or other resources. Your typical workday as a pre-mine wars coal miner would have involved waking up at the break of dawn and descending into the dark underworld, with no protective clothing and just a small lantern for light. Then, of course, there was also the high risk of fire and collapse that miners faced every day while at their subterranean livelihoods. As seen in the still-burning coal mine fires of Centralia, Pennsylvania, a mine could catch fire by accident. Risk of fire was an ever-present reality, and if a fire began, any oxygen in the mine would feed the inferno, and the combination of decreasing oxygen and increased smoke would asphyxiate anyone inside. Just your average, day-to-day additional mining risks and hazards would have also included mines collapsing, floods, methane gas explosions, and exposure to dust, mercury, radon, and fumes from welding. Other risks miners faced involved injuries from heavy lifting or pushing that came in the form of joint problems, back problems, broken bones, and even getting crushed. Naturally, with the risks that came along with the job, miners and their families felt bitterness towards the companies they worked for when the companies exploited them and didn't protect them on the job with physical or financial protection. It was essentially World War I all over again, machine guns and all. Fed up with their unbelievably exploitative working conditions, WV miners were angry with and distrustful of the coal companies they were laboring for by the summer of 1921, and they went on strike to prove it. However, their strike was met by private security forces who were employed to control and put down the strikes on the part of the coal companies. With small arms, improvised explosives, and machine guns, the fighting soon spiraled out of control into all-out war. The West Virginia coal fields became battlefields, and miners resorted to building fortifications in towns and in the wooded hills. Machine gun emplacements were constructed, and guerrilla tactics were used in the form of raids on opposing breastworks. This is not surprising at all considering that by 1919, there were many veterans of World War I who had returned to civilian life and were working in the coal mines. By 1921, when the National Guard stepped in to stop the fighting, Army Air Force planes were flying overhead and dropping improvised explosives. Women and girls ripped up train tracks and smuggled guns. With the outbreak of hostilities between striking miners and coal companies, the first tactic used by companies to keep business going was to lock out miners and bring in replacement workers by train to isolated mines and camps. Commonly known in the labor world as scabs, workers who wouldn't strike or join unions are sometimes used as cheaper and more reliable labor over workers who attempt to bring big corporations to the bargaining table. Understandably, the miners and their families were infuriated by this. While the miners and union members responded with more strikes, women and girls took the fight to the rail tracks, tearing up entire sections of railroad tracks, which effectively stopped companies from bringing in replacement workers. Women contributed to the effort before, during, and after the fight by operating as effective gun smugglers. Willie Helton supported the strikers and did her part by helping to supply the miners who were striking. Years later she recalled, "I slipped one gun down into my dress on this side. I had one gun on either side of me, and I had a pocket full of shells. I couldn't hardly walk." Another eyewitness to the events of the time, Grace Jackson, recalled that many women even participated in armed opposition by shooting at trains that were used to bring in non-union replacement workers and guards. A train would be spotted approaching and women would hide in the woods on either side of the railroad tracks. When a signal was given, they would all begin shooting at the train with shotguns, rifles, pistols, and even machine gun. The Battle of Blair Mountain pitted the U.S. National Guard against 10,000 miners. The Battle of Blair Mountain took place in August of 1921 after a series of smaller confrontations in the spring of that year. Now considered to be the largest armed uprising in U.S. history next to the Civil War, the Battle of Blair Mountain saw 10,000 unionized mine workers storm the area and begin shooting at roughly 3,000 local deputies, law enforcement officers, and private coal company personnel. The company men fired back, and the engagement snowballed into a battle that lasted for about a week. The term battle is quite appropriate as the fighting involved 13,000 people total, and by the week's end, President Harding had declared martial law. Once the decision was made, General Bandholz arrived in the area at the head of 2,100 National Guardsmen, and their mere presence quelled the fighting. Amazingly, the majority of miners seem to have welcomed the arrival of soldiers. This is not surprising considering that the violence that had been occurring over the past several decades evolved out of desperation on behalf of the miners who felt that the injustices inflicted on them by the coal companies and biased law enforcement were going unnoticed by the highest echelons of power. Therefore, very few of them were actually eager for the conflict. They simply wanted some concessions that would give them a quality of life. Coal companies terrorized and intimidated workers, putting the value of the dollar above everything else. The coal companies that opposed unionization and fought against strikes did everything within and outside the law to stay on top and muscle their opposition into a more accommodating position. The coal companies were known for employing intimidation tactics with a complete disregard for safety, driving armored trains past camps inhabited by miners and families, shooting at people with machine guns, and openly assassinating individuals were just a few of these terror-inducing strategies. Aside from these, the companies also employed spies and agents to inform on strikers, union representatives, and miners who were still working in order to exercise complete control over everything that happened in the mines, company towns, and camps. Big Brother was always watching, and Big Brother was mean. Other forms of intimidation and control were more passive. Companies would lock workers out of their mines to prevent them from working, thus not having to pay them. Pay was often taken out of checks to cover the costs of tools and other basic needs that were leased to workers while company store prices were hiked up. It was the epitome of a monopolized market with the ability to extract every ounce of capital and lifeblood from its workers. The Bull Moose special armored trains shot at mining families in the dead of the night. The ruthless cruelty of the coal companies seems to have had no limits. During the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek coal labor strike of 1912, coal miners and their families were living in a tent camp in Holly Grove when the train known as the Bull Moose Special came roaring by them at night carrying deputies, mine guards, company police, and sheriffs who all began shooting from the train at women and children. In the end, only one person in the camp was killed during the shooting. The single casualty may indicate that the shooting was to intimidate the miners and their families rather than to actually cause death. But the unacceptable use of terror was just one episode in a series of attacks and retaliations between the striking miners and coal companies. 2 days later, the strikers descended upon Mucklow, West Virginia, where the mine guards were encamped. A frenzy ensued. Children were totally exploited in the mines. The Industrial Revolution brought millions of people into the age of the factory when mass production of goods began to occur in the mid-18th century. People from the lower classes came for opportunities, and out of necessity, to work in what would turn out to often be exploitative and extremely dangerous working conditions. After the American Civil War, new inventions and industries required new or more resources and, thus, more labor. Children worked in factories and coal mines often because they were small and able to maneuver in more cramped conditions and with increasingly intricate tools. Economic necessity required many children to work to help their parents, who were also working full-time, and between 1890 and 1910, the number of children under the age of 15 in the labor force rose from 1.5 to 2 million. Children who worked in coal mines were at a greater risk than their adult adult colleagues because they were still growing. Exposure to elements and chemicals, long shifts, occupational accidents, and a general lack of nutrition caused many children to become permanently stunted and not be able to grow physically or mentally at normal rates. Because of the same economic pressures, many children had to skip going to school in order to work and support their families. The conditions and lives of children in these circumstances were documented by a former New York City school teacher turned photographic journalist, Louis Hine, who journeyed to the coal camps and mines to take notes and photographs of conditions while working undercover for the National Child Labor Committee. Mary Harris' mother Jones was the miners' bulldog on the battlefield. No stranger to suffering and injustice, Mary Harris Jones emigrated from Ireland with her family to escape the potato famine of the 1840s, first arriving in Canada. Soon, the family moved again and arrived in Chicago. Following the horrible American Civil War, Jones lost her husband and children during the 1867 yellow fever epidemic and lost her home in the Chicago fire 4 years later. With personal tragedy and blue-collar work experience under her belt, Jones became a prominent labor movement advocate and supporter of the United Mine Workers Association in the last years of the 19th century. After campaigning for the union for years, she arrived on the scene in West Virginia to advocate for mine workers and stir up union support among their ranks. Even in her 80s, she and other socially progressive women continued giving speeches on coal fields and in mines. This was not only to support them but also to raise issues that affected miners and workers on a larger scale. Even as an elderly woman, she was arrested during a miners' strike and put in jail. Due to the support she had among miners for her work on their behalf, she was granted a pardon and continued her mission. While she maintained a stern and realistic position on issues that miners and all working people faced, she leavened her rhetoric with a maternal care. This combination of values caused many to nickname her Mother Jones, and that name would be immortalized in her honor by the award-winning publication Today. Striking miners and their families were evicted and harassed by coal companies. The coal companies in West Virginia were unforgiving to those who stood up against them. When workers demonstrated or went on strike, the company exercised its power and evicted miners and their families from company-owned housing and other privileges. With nowhere to go, entire families relied on the support of the Mine Workers Union, housed in tent camps while strikes continued. Once evicted, the miners and their families were constantly harassed by private security from their coal company, agents from the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, and Pinkerton agents, who acted as additional muscle on behalf of the coal companies. This double-edged sword of eviction and abuse proved too much a violation of people's basic rights. It set the stage for war. Coal company security executed Sheriff Sid Hatfield. Sidney Hatfield, known as Sid, was born in Kentucky in May of 1893 and worked in coal mines in the surrounding area until 1919 when he was named police chief of Mattoon by Mayor C.C. Testament. Through his work experience, he felt a strong bond with coal miners and a sense of urgency to act on behalf of working folks when violence erupted in West Virginia. Before the Blair Mountain Campaign, several striking miners had been evicted by Baldwin-Felt agents, and a confrontation that followed quickly turned into a shootout. After the smoke had cleared, 7 agents, Mayor Testament, and 2 strikers lay dead and Hatfield's fate was sealed. The following year, he and nearly 20 others involved in the shootout were tried for murder and soon acquitted. Before the trial was over, however, agents from Baldwin-Felt cornered the accused outside of the Welch courthouse and gunned down Sid Hatfield and Edward Chambers in front of their families. This tragedy sums up the level of extreme tension and anger felt on both sides of the struggle for rights in West Virginia. There are at least 150 known casualties from the decades-long war between the late 19th century and the first 20 years of the 20th century. A series of violent, armed conflicts flared up between coal miners and company security, strike breakers, and local law enforcement. The exact number of fatalities isn't known, but between 1874 and 1933 as many as 150 striking miners, guards, and law enforcement officers were killed in small battles. The reckless nature of these clashes and inconsistent records make the number of casualties somewhat unreliable, and the number of those killed may be significantly higher. Notable engagements between workers and company men took place mostly in the eastern U.S. coal mining areas of West Virginia, but they also happened in Pennsylvania and as far west as Colorado. The reason for this was that workers would often strike or take up arms in solidarity with workers in other areas. Armed conflict broke out sporadically in 1874, 1897, 1898, 1902, 1912, 1914, 1920, and 1921. The coal wars were also about women's rights and racial equality. While most of the coal miners in West Virginia were white, native-born American men, large percentages of these workers were also European immigrants who had arrived in the United States to pursue better opportunities. Also making up a significant portion of the mining workforce were African Americans who had arrived in the area during the Great Migration period, a large-scale northward movement of African Americans from the rural South. Because the West Virginia coal wars were incidents of class warfare, there was a surprisingly strong solidarity among workers both native-born and foreign, as well as solidarity between whites and blacks. In fact, some of the strongest supporters of the strikes and demonstrations for change were women and people of color, two of the groups who would benefit most. For the early 20th century, this is quite uncommon and inspiring. During the outbreaks of fighting between the miners and security agents, whites and blacks were seen fighting side by side for a noble, shared cause. Every aspect of a miner's life was controlled by the coal company. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, big coal companies attempted to control the lives of their workers and their families with an alarming degree of success, going so far as to require workers and their families to live in company towns. Coal corporations effectively isolated people by forcing them to only use company-owned schools, stores, and facilities. By only allowing miners limited and tightly controlled options, corporations controlled almost every aspect of a miner's life and the lives of his family members. In a very dark sense, coal towns that were hidden prisons. If a miner didn't want to use company-owned options for non-work-related needs, the miner could lose his job, leaving him and his family with nothing. It was the coal company's way or the highway, and with many mouths to feed, it's easy to see why miners made the decision that they did for so long. After the fighting, miners practicing self-defense were indicted for murder. After the Battle of Blair Mountain, the largest armed uprising since the Civil War, ended and the violence was stopped, the U.S. National Guard confiscated all weapons from both sides and began arresting any miners with arms. Fighters who voluntarily surrendered were sent home without further punishment, while any fighters who were considered to be leaders or violence instigators were arrested and put on trial. After the violence and unrest, a total of 1,217 indictments were put forward. Of those, 24 were for treason and 325 were for murder. However, only two individuals, James Wilburn and his son, were given sentences. Unfortunately, the United Mine Workers Association temporarily lost power in West Virginia, for a little while at least. In 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act was passed, which outlawed the corporate use of private police forces and spies to operate within companies, and it further protected the rights of workers to organize and representation of their unions. Ultimately, the voice of coal miners and workers was heard and respected.